Hi there. It's January of 2026, and I thought we would come on and talk a lot about the eight pillars of recovery. One of the things that I find that a lot of cancer recovery patients struggle with is the amount of information, right? Generally speaking, most of my patients struggle with this, but cancer is a special beast because there's a lot of an emotional component to it, and cancer recovery is no different. You've just been through what can be described as, very complicated and challenging pieces, and then now we have to start to try to recover our system. And so I've created in the book, if you've read this, eight pillars of recovery. Now this can extend to a lot of different situations, chronic illness and those types of things, but we're talking about cancer specifically. So what does it all mean? Because I've attempted to make it, break it down, and what I'm going to do today is talk you through what each section is and then the scorecard and what that means, right? So cellular function is getting down to the smallest, the tiniest, the most compact part of our function. Okay. And so what we're really looking at here is we're looking at supporting our body from all the levels of deficiency, most importantly, our mitochondria function. So if we go to the eight pillars scorecard, you'll see the different labs that you can reference, right? So there's a section here where it says, oh, take a look at these labs and why are they important, right? And so really this is the foundation. This is like the smallest cellular function. This is the smallest piece that everybody's built out of. So a liver is built out of cells, and brainstem, and all this stuff. And the whole purpose of these cells is to create energy, help you break things down. And so ultimately, when we look at this, what we're really looking at is, are there deficiencies? Are there ways that your mitochondria have been impacted by treatment, right? And by lifestyles? And how do we break that down? So in the scorecard, you'll see there's above it, to get to the scorecard, there's a bunch of questions, and they feel really sometimes random. But what we can do is, as a naturopathic doctor, what I've done is create basic information that makes sense to you, that you can say yes, no, maybe so. Add them, give them weighted value, and then bring about a compact section. Okay. And so this is where you'll take a look and you'll say, okay, what's my total? Okay, so I go through and I ask all these questions, and you go, okay, one, two, three, here, no, yes, and then you get your total at the bottom. You add them all up. It's pretty simple, basic numbers. One is one, zero is zero, two is two, so on and so forth. And if this section scores an eight or higher, it means at some level we need to consider this. Now, does this mean this is the first thing? I truly think for most patients, I'm always doing this in the background, okay? And then I'll look at what the other things are that we have to deal with, right? So we kind of build it from the ground up, right? However, that being stated, if we have to prioritize, so, we might go, A, we need digestion, we need to deal with infections, toxic load, and always we're looking at cellular function. So at some point, we're always looking at that cellular function. Okay. This is one of the reasons why the labs are the way they are. We're looking at your vitamin D levels. We're looking at B12, iron, zinc. Iron is ferritin as well. So we're looking at inflammation ratios and how well you're doing with your nutrients in terms of, albumin can be representative of how you're breaking down protein in your food, right? And so these are things that are just relevant for us. Okay. And so we're definitely feeling that this is always going in the background. What I generally tell patients is that sometimes your priorities might be different than what I see on paper, right? So, in this year of 2026, I always ask patients, what do you feel in this picture, right? What's the strongest? Some people will go, oh, my weakness is toxic load. I work in industry. The industry has a lot of toxicity, right? I've had this history. I was exposed. Other people might say my immune system, I'm always sick. I'm never getting better. It takes me a lot longer, that kind of stuff. Some women that are going through hormonal changes post cancer and or have gone through them before and then are seeing symptomology, endocrine might be the big thing, and that can have an impact on sleep, weight gain, weight management, those types of things. And so each person has a little bit of something different. Okay. The next section is also something that's working on in the background, and this is like the life hack section. So epigenetic factors are really about, yes, the mitochondria, but more importantly, how we're turning things on and off. Okay. And so these are like the things that you've this is the coding specifically for how the mitochondria are working. They're the coding for how you detox things in your body. And this is what I would call an important piece, right? The single nucleotide polymorphism data is important. It doesn't change, but how you expresses it changes. So stress is a big factor here, right? How are we dealing with our stress? So we go back up to that stress survey. How's our body handling that stress? Are we what state are we in with our stress? And do we need to establish how our body handles stress and its reaction to stress? Okay, so you'll notice some of the information that is the next steps for the cellular function are similar to the epigenetic factors. The key component is that, for example, not all B12s are created equally for people with different SNP information, right? So this is where the epigenetic factors can really get into your individualization. So it really helps with individualization. Um, I mean, in a perfect world, I'd get everyone to do this testing because it really gives us information about how certain drugs would work in your body, how certain nutrients work in the body. I really love this information in terms of coming up with nutritional information, dietary wise, right? And really exploring it. So I do think it's a very important factor. It can feel very unobtainable, right? There's some basics that I've been in practice long enough that I'll say, oh, this is something we need to do. We're going to avoid these types of B12s or this type of iron, or we're going to avoid this because you always get sick with that. So this is a very interesting factor. The next one is toxic load, and this one can be very insidious, right? It can be very hidden. Most people don't know it. We all are exposed to toxins in the environment, right? Mold is everywhere. We hope to gosh that it isn't in our house and that we haven't lived in a space where we've been exposed to it, because that can really reduce, it can really have a toxic load burden. We hope that you don't have hobbies like glass blowing or stained glass windows where there can be really high levels of those types of toxic load. Some basic, easy ones to understand is like living with a smoker or being a smoker. That's a toxic load that we need to consider. And so ultimately, this is a roadblock sometimes that can cause damage to that cellular function and turning those genes on and off. And so it is almost like it's the once you if you're working on that cellular function that we were talking about and that epigenetics, if there is this constant toxic load that you're having that we're not dealing with, then it can stop that progress from seeing helpfulness. Now you also have to understand that this has changed because some types of therapy in cancer include toxins, right? So chemotherapy is a toxin. Outside of how it works, there are those that are higher in their burden, right? And so there are those that include heavy metals or those types of things, and it's not necessarily a direct impact of the treatment, but it comes along with it. And so this is where we really need to look at, when you're looking at the labs, we're looking at how well our liver and our kidneys are functioning, how well our skin is working. We really need to hone in our digestion is working. This really does pair with a lot of those extra organs that we're looking at trying to eliminate it. You'll notice in the next steps, I do say you really should look at consulting a practitioner, because if this is a place where you think that you need support, I would highly take a look at getting a partnership in order to move forward, because it's not so easy as just going to a health food store and taking a detoxing piece. I would say the other caveat to this is just pushing detox is not enough. So sometimes they'll be like, "Oh, this product will help you detox," and that's great. But the question that I would say that you should ask is, what's the binding material? So it's not enough to try to increase detoxification or eliminate the toxin load, but you also have to try to bind those things that you're trying to eliminate so that they aren't causing more problems and having more issues. Okay. So here's infections. Okay, so the next level we get to, right? So these two are definitely work hand in hand. Toxic load can stop us from seeing these, move forward. Toxic load can have an impact on infections itself. Okay, so infections, these are things that sometimes people are looking at and they don't realize they have, right? So this is a section where we really want to look at reducing inflammation, balancing the immune system, which comes later, but more importantly, identifying if we think we are a person who has infections, right? Or if those infections are something that's coming chronically, right? So, fungus in the toenails that can show chronic levels of infection. Sometimes like eczema, right? Sometimes eczema can show, can have chronic infections, right? Sometimes there's other things like, secondary impacts, right? Like, um, inflammatory bowel diseases can have impacts with infections, cold sores, right? I've had lots of patients who've gone through their chemo and radiation, and then they get cold sores afterwards, and they were like, I had a few before, but now they just can't seem to get rid of them. This is where this section is something where we go, oh, do we have to look at, is there something else happening, or something that's been consistently impacted that hasn't recovered, right? So checking in on the total white blood cells, because sometimes this can take a bit to recover. Checking in on the neutrophils and the lymphocytes, because these are reactionary, short term. Checking in on inflammatory markers, and going deeper, sometimes looking for those infectious pieces if we really need to. I would also say this is a place where there is a bit more. If we're looking at active infections, we want to do something specific to start with, and you'll see these herbs, right, that I've written in here, but you also really want to make sure that there's second steps. Okay. The next one is immune system and slash inflammation. So a lot of people, what does this mean, right? So now we're moving on from infections to immune system. You would think that they would be the same, but they're not entirely, right? Because an infection can be hidden and the immune system is working really hard in the background to keep it at bay. But the immune system itself, how is it responding and reacting? And I have this conversation with a lot of patients, right? Um, you want to recover your immune system. Most conventional treatments for cancer will compromise your immune system, and that's important to note, right? It will have an impact, a direct impact on your total white blood cells, all the different types of white blood cells. It'll lower those amounts. There's a statistic that was researched really heavily that came out about 2, maybe 3 years ago, that showed that 80% of patients that have gone through chemotherapy treatment come out massively deficient in vitamin D. We unfortunately don't know what their status was going in, but you can imagine recovering your immune system is massively difficult if your vitamin D is low. And that's one of the reasons why, we go and we start with that in the first pillar and we put these things together. Okay. Ultimately, your immune system and inflammation is the way to determine the correction that's happening inside the body. Okay. Afterwards, putting those pieces back together, because your immune system and your inflammation is the way that your body tries to heal things, right? And so if you're having this elevated level of inflammation, you really want to look at it and go, am I healing things or am I not? Why am I still making inflammation? What's going on there, right? And really understanding it. It's one of the ways that we can look on the inside and really support us. Okay. Endocrine balancing, next part, right? So now we go into the depths. So endocrine, what is that? That's thyroid. It's sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone. It is metabolic rate, right? It really does look at a lot of those types of things that we're looking at. Okay. I would really say that, oh, hold on. This was what I was looking at. Yeah. Okay. So we're also looking at with endocrine your internal rhythms, right? So how well are things talking to one another, this is a place where sometimes fatigue can come into play. It's a place where a lot of people miss and skip over, right? So if a woman's never, or if somebody's never had a thyroid concern, it's not like they're looking at their thyroid afterwards. And so this is a place where we want to look at it. Balancing blood sugars is also part of the endocrine system. So developing insulin resistance is really can be a side factor of developing cancer. And then of course, post-treatment, and especially for those that see weight gain when they're going through things, okay, with their treatments. And so, or sometimes medications can have an impact on that, right? So there are some patients who end up on higher doses of steroids that can have a huge impact on their adrenal function, thyroid function, their blood sugar regulation. And so ultimately, this is usually a forgotten and underlying cause of fatigue. It can be an underlying difficulty with weight balancing afterwards. Management with stress. This is the place where the cortisol is actually made, right? So really looking at those functions and putting those things together to support that is the endocrine part of that. Digestion is the next one, and I don't know why this doesn't have the digestion portion. But digestion is the next balancing act that you're looking at. Okay. Again, digestion is really about how comfortable your digestion is. Does it happen regularly? Would you classify yourself as having difficulties with going? Are you noticing bloating, right? Food intolerances, like what is a list of foods that you're trying to avoid bigger and bigger? Gut recovery is really important because some of those therapies that people have to go through, they just focus on they focus on killing the fastest recovering, replicating cells in the body. And the number one place where the fastest replicating cells in the body is in the digestive tract, and that's why most traditional treatments come alongside with chemo, with diarrhea and constipation and nausea as a side effect. And so really understanding your digestion is key. If it's different than it was before, has it gone back to the pattern of what you've had previously? Those are important factors to consider. And then the last one is structural changes. Okay, this is a very interesting one because it gets forgotten. How does your body move? Do you feel constriction? If you've had breast cancer and you've gone through the recovery and they've just done IVs and all the chemos and everything else, have you been able to, do you get full range of motion? Are there any parts of your body that have been injured specifically because of treatment, right? When we have surgery, there is scar tissue that's broken up, that's created, and sometimes we bypass that to do the centralized treatment, and I understand why. There's just not enough time in the day sometimes. However, we don't need to live in a place where we have this consistent structure. If we're having lymphedema, if you're having strength and mobility issues, one side versus the other, in general, all around, this means that there's been some structural changes, right? Those structural changes can be systemic, right? The whole body, right? Sometimes if we've lost too much weight or the treatment's been too bad, we'll lose our muscle strength and that kind of thing. And so we have to build that back up. So those structural changes are very, very important. I do hope you've learned something and you can see the intensity and the amazingness of the 8 pillars of recovery. I do. It is a place where sometimes people can feel the most overwhelmed. So I do want to say you just take it one step at a time and you come back to it. This is something that you get to come back to. And one of the benefits of doing the work in the book is that you can go back and do those free questionnaires and go, oh, this is different. It is allowing you to have that check-in piece without having to do a ton of labs and those types of things. It is important to still do labs, but in between when we're doing the labs, you can absolutely use this as a check-in piece. I hope you learned something and you were able to use the 8 pillars of recovery as you move through 2026.